My mother-in-law paid my ex to ruin my wedding, and my husband blamed me for everything. I still remember the exact moment I knew my first engagement was over, even though it took me another 3 months to actually admit it to myself. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of crisp autumn night that usually made me feel alive and hopeful. I was sitting in my car outside his apartment, the engine still running because the heater was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. Through his living room window, I watched him laugh at something on his phone. The way his face lit up, the way he tilted his head back with that particular joy I hadn't seen directed at me in months, maybe longer. There was an ease in his expression that felt foreign to me now, like watching footage of someone I used to know. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, I asked him who he'd been texting. "Just a friend," he said, without looking up from the screen. His voice had that particular flatness that I'd learned to recognize as the sound of a lie being told so often it no longer required effort. The same friend who had been just a friend for the entire 2 years we'd been together. Her name doesn't matter anymore. I've made peace with that part of my story. But back then, it consumed me like a slow-burning fever I couldn't break. She was always there, hovering at the edges of our relationship like a ghost I couldn't exorcise no matter how hard I tried. They'd known each other since college, he explained patiently, as if I were a child who simply didn't understand how adult friendships worked. As if that somehow made it normal for her to call him at 11 at night when she knew we'd be settling in for bed. As if it justified the inside jokes I was never part of. The references to shared memories that predated my existence in his life. He'd compare my cooking to hers without even realizing he was doing it, saying things like, "This is good, but have you ever tried making it with fresh herbs like she does?" I told myself I was being paranoid. I repeated it like a mantra every time my stomach twisted with doubt. I told myself that trust was the foundation of any relationship, that jealousy was poison, that if I couldn't trust the man I loved, then maybe the problem was me. Maybe I was too insecure, too damaged from past experiences, too broken to recognize healthy behavior when I saw it. We got engaged on our 2-year anniversary. He proposed at the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date, down on one knee beside a table decorated with candles and rose petals. The other diners applauded. A woman at the next table dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. It was picture perfect, straight out of a romantic comedy. And I said yes, because I thought that was what love looked like. I thought the unease in my stomach was just nerves, just the weight of a big decision settling onto my shoulders. I ignored the fact that when I called my mother to tell her the news, I couldn't quite make myself sound as happy as I should have been. 3 weeks after the engagement, he sat me down on our couch with a serious expression that made my heart drop into my feet. He said he needed a pause. "Just some time to figure things out," he explained, running his hands through his hair in that nervous way he did when he knew he was saying something I wouldn't want to hear. He wanted to make sure we were making the right decision. I asked him what there was to figure out, and he couldn't give me a straight answer. He just kept saying he needed space, needed to clear his head, needed to work through some things on his own. I gave him the space. I moved back in with my parents temporarily, into my childhood bedroom that still had posters of bands I'd loved in high school tacked to the walls. I told everyone we were just taking a breather, that it was healthy to have some time apart before such a big commitment. I believed it too. I believed that he was working through something important, that he'd come back to me ready to commit fully, that our relationship would be stronger for having weathered this storm. He never called. Not once in those 6 weeks. I'd text him and get one-word responses hours later, sometimes just a thumbs-up emoji that felt like a slap in the face. I'd drive by his apartment complex on my way home from work, telling myself I just happened to be going that route, and I'd see her car parked outside. The same red hatchback with the dented bumper that I'd seen in his parking lot 100 times before. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself that they were just friends, that he was probably leaning on her for support during this confusing time. I told myself all kinds of lies to keep from facing the truth. The truth came from his cousin, of all people. We'd gotten close during the relationship, bonding over our shared love of hiking and our equally dark senses of humor. She called me one night, her voice tight with anger and apology. She said she'd been wrestling with whether to tell me for weeks, that she'd finally decided I deserved to know. She told me everything. They'd been sleeping together for at least 8 months, probably longer. The pause wasn't about figuring things out. It was about figuring out how to leave me without looking like the bad guy, without giving me any grounds for anger or blame. He'd been telling people that I was the one with doubts, that I was the one pulling away, that he was the victim of my cold feet. The pain was extraordinary. Not just the betrayal itself, though, that cut deep enough to feel physical, but the gaslighting. The way he'd made me question my own instincts for years while he carried on his affair right under my nose. Every time I'd felt something was wrong, every time my gut had screamed that the situation with his friend wasn't normal, he'd convinced me I was being insecure, controlling, jealous, paranoid. He'd made me apologize for my own intuition. He'd made me feel crazy for seeing what was right in front of me. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes you find unexpected strength down there. Once the initial shock and grief started to fade, something else emerged. Something harder and clearer, like a blade being forged in fire. I quit the corporate job I hated, the one I'd kept for 3 years because he said it was practical. Because he said stability was more important than passion. I took the savings I'd been hoarding for our wedding, every penny I'd set aside for the dress and the venue and the honeymoon, and I invested it in a business idea I'd been nurturing secretly for years, a small boutique specializing in handcrafted jewelry and accessories. I'd been making pieces in my spare time since college, selling them at craft fairs and online marketplaces, dreaming of the day I might be brave enough to turn it into something real. Everyone thought I was having a breakdown. My mother asked gently if I'd considered talking to someone professional. My father just looked worried every time I mentioned the business plan. Maybe they were right to be concerned. Maybe I was channeling my heartbreak into something reckless. But 6 months later, my little shop was turning a profit. Small at first, just enough to cover the rent and pay myself a modest salary. Then larger, as word of mouth spread and my customer base grew. I was learning that I liked myself a lot better when I wasn't trying to shrink to fit someone else's expectations. The next 2 years were about reconstruction. I built my business from a single rented space in a strip mall to a thriving operation with 3 employees and a robust online presence. I made friends who actually listened when I talked, who didn't dismiss my feelings or make me feel like I was too much. I went to therapy every Wednesday at 4 o'clock and unpacked all the ways I'd been taught to doubt myself, all the patterns I'd absorbed from that relationship and the ones that came before it. I learned to trust my gut again, slowly and painfully, like relearning to walk after a bad accident. And then, because life has a sense of humor that borders on cruel sometimes, I met him. He walked into my shop on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March, looking for a gift for his mother's birthday. He was soaking wet from the downpour outside, apologizing for dripping on my hardwood floors while simultaneously trying to shake the rain out of his dark hair. I remember thinking he had kind eyes, the sort of eyes that actually looked at you when you talked instead of looking through you to whatever was more interesting behind you. We ended up chatting for almost an hour, long after he'd made his purchase, long after any reasonable customer would have left. He was a consultant, he told me, specializing in helping small businesses optimize their operations. He'd been doing it for almost a decade, traveling constantly, helping entrepreneurs figure out how to scale without losing what made them special in the first place. The irony of an efficiency expert wandering into my chaotic little boutique wasn't lost on either of us. He came back the next week, ostensibly to see if we had anything new in stock that his sister might like. He didn't buy anything. He just asked questions about the business, offered a few suggestions that were actually genuinely helpful, and somehow stayed for another 45 minutes. The week after that, he didn't even pretend to be shopping. He just admitted he'd wanted to see me, that he'd been thinking about our conversations since the first one, that he'd never met anyone who talked about their work with the kind of passion I did. By the third visit, he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, somewhere outside my shop where I wasn't technically working. I surprised myself by saying yes. The connection was immediate and terrifying. After what I'd been through, I'd built walls so high I wasn't sure anyone would ever be able to scale them. But he was patient in a way I hadn't experienced before. He didn't push for more than I was ready to give. He asked questions about my life, my work, my dreams, and he actually listened to the answers instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He remembered small details I mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later. When I told him about my past, about the betrayal and the gaslighting, about the way I'd spent 2 years convinced I was crazy, he didn't try to convince me he was different. He just said he understood why I might need time to trust again, and that he was willing to earn it. Our relationship unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a careful dance where we both knew the steps, but weren't rushing to finish. We dated for 6 months before I let him stay the night. We dated for a year before I gave him a key to my apartment. He never complained about the pace. He seemed to understand intuitively that my caution wasn't about him. It was about me learning to trust my own judgment again, about me proving to myself that I could take my time and still end up somewhere good. He helped me find balance in ways I hadn't known I needed. I'd been pouring everything into my business, working 70-hour weeks, telling myself it was passion when really it was just another way of hiding from intimacy, another way of avoiding the vulnerability of letting someone close. He encouraged me to hire more help, to take actual days off, to remember that I was building a life, not just a company. And the crazy thing was, when I finally listened, my business didn't suffer. It thrived. Turns out exhaustion isn't actually a prerequisite for success. 18 months into our relationship, he proposed. We were hiking in the mountains, nothing fancy, just the two of us and a thermos of hot chocolate, and a view that stretched all the way to the horizon. He got down on one knee on a rocky outcropping and said he wanted to spend the rest of his life making sure I never doubted my worth again. I said yes, and this time when I called my mother, I couldn't stop crying from happiness. Real happiness, not the performance of it. But I'd learned my lessons, and I wasn't going to repeat old mistakes no matter how right this felt. When I brought up the idea of a prenuptial agreement, I thought he'd understand. My business was my baby, built from the ashes of my previous heartbreak with my own 2 hands and countless sleepless nights. I needed to protect it, not because I didn't trust him, but because I'd learned that protecting myself wasn't the same as not loving someone. He understood immediately. Of course, he said, whatever makes you feel safe. His family did not share his perspective. The first time I met his parents, I sensed something was off beneath the surface politeness. They smiled at all the right moments. They said all the appropriate things about how lovely it was to finally meet me, how much their son had told them, how beautiful my shop sounded. But there was a coldness underneath that I couldn't quite place, like standing on ice that looked solid but might crack at any moment. They asked a lot of questions. Too many questions, and the wrong kind. Not curious questions about who I was as a person, what I cared about, what made me laugh. Instead, they asked probing questions about where I came from, what my parents did for a living, how much my business made, whether I had any outstanding debts. When they found out about the prenup, the pleasant facade cracked completely. His mother called him the next day, and I overheard parts of the conversation from the next room. Words like gold digger and manipulative drifted through the door clearly enough to make my face burn with humiliation and fury. His father followed up with a long email that my fiancé read aloud to me, his voice tight with frustration. It was a lecture about how real families trust each other, how asking for a prenup was essentially admitting you expected the marriage to fail. They demanded to know whose idea the agreement had been, and when he said it was mutual, they made it clear they didn't believe him for a second. The meeting that followed was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. His parents sat across from us at their dining room table like interviewers, not future family members. His mother wanted to know about my previous engagement, about why it had ended, about whether I'd gotten any kind of settlement from my ex. Her tone implied she already thought she knew the answer. His father questioned whether my business was really as successful as I claimed, or whether I was exaggerating to seem like I wasn't after their son's money. The prenup is fair, I explained, keeping my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. It protects both of us equally. What I had before the marriage stays mine. What he had stays his. What we build together gets split evenly if things don't work out. That's not me being greedy. That's me being practical. They didn't see it that way. To them, a woman who wanted to protect her assets was automatically suspicious. A woman who made more money than her fiancé was automatically a threat. I watched their faces as they cataloged all the ways I didn't fit their image of a suitable wife, and I watched the man I loved struggle to find the words to defend me. That struggle would come to define the next year of our lives. The warning signs were subtle at first, easy to dismiss or explain away. His parents would make comments at family dinners, little digs wrapped in sweetness. His mother would ask when I was planning to sell my business, her tone making it clear she assumed this career was obviously temporary. Something I'd give up once I became a proper wife and started focusing on what really mattered. They'd wonder aloud whether our future children would have a mother who was actually present, or whether they'd be raised by nannies and babysitters while I chased success. He'd laugh these comments off when I brought them up later in private. They're from a different generation, he'd say with a shrug. They don't mean anything by it. They'll come around once they get to know you better. Just give them time. But it wasn't just comments. It was the way family decisions somehow always went their way. It was the way he'd agree with their criticisms when I wasn't in the room, then minimize them when I confronted him. I found out through his sister, who became an unexpected ally in those months, that he'd told his parents I was being too sensitive about the prenup situation, that I'd probably come around eventually and drop the whole thing. He hadn't mentioned any of that to me. I tried diplomacy. I tried bending so far backward I nearly broke. I suggested we limit family visits to once a month, give everyone some breathing room to adjust to the new dynamic. He acted like I'd asked him to abandon his parents on the street corner. "They need me," he said, his jaw tight with an anger I rarely saw directed at anyone but me. "They're getting older. My dad's health isn't what it used to be. I can't just cut them off because you don't like them." "I don't dislike them," I said, which was only partly true. I dislike being treated like an intruder in my own relationship. He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked at me with something that might have been frustration or might have been pity and changed the subject. The financial situation became impossible to ignore somewhere around month 8 of our engagement. Despite their constant criticism of my career, his parents had no problem asking for money. It started small enough that I didn't think to question it. Could we help with a medical bill? Their insurance didn't cover everything, and the specialist his mother needed to see was expensive. "Of course," I said. "Family helps family." Then it was repairs for their house. The roof was leaking, and contractors were so expensive these days, especially for people on a fixed income. Then it was their car, which needed a new transmission and would cost more to fix than it was worth. Then it was a loan to cover some investments that hadn't worked out the way they'd hoped. A loan that somehow never got repaid, followed by another urgent request that was always an emergency that couldn't wait. The math was simple when I finally sat down to calculate it. Most of this money was coming from my business, from the income I generated while his parents told everyone who would listen that career women made terrible wives and mothers. They were happy to spend money from a source they openly disrespected. The hypocrisy was so blatant it felt almost absurd. I finally confronted him after the 4th financial emergency in 2 months. "Do you see what's happening here?" I asked, spreading out bank statements on our kitchen table. "They criticize everything I do, everything I've built, but they have no problem spending what I earn. That's not family helping family. That's exploitation." He got defensive in the way I was learning to recognize, his shoulders drawing up and his voice going flat. "They're struggling. Would you really let them lose their house over your pride?" "My pride?" I repeated. "Is that what you think this is about? Pride?" We fought for hours that night. In the end, he agreed to set some boundaries. He would tell them we couldn't be their emergency fund anymore. He would ask them to stop the passive-aggressive comments about my work. He would establish some independence from their influence. The boundaries lasted about 3 weeks. When the money stopped flowing as freely as before, the manipulation escalated. His mother called him crying, saying she'd never felt so abandoned by her own son, that she couldn't believe he'd choose a woman he'd only known for 2 years over the people who'd raised him. His father sent long emails about family values and loyalty and the importance of honoring your parents. The subtext clear, I had poisoned their relationship. They started inviting him to dinners and holiday gatherings without including me, then acting surprised and hurt when I mentioned it. I suggested couples therapy. "We need help navigating this," I said one night after another exhausting argument. "Someone objective who can help us find a balance that works for everyone." He refused without hesitation. "I'm not going to pay a stranger to tell me how to deal with my own family. This is between us. We can figure it out ourselves." But it wasn't between us. It was between him and his parents, and I was increasingly feeling like a spectator in my own engagement. Every time he chose their comfort over mine, every time he dismissed my concerns as oversensitivity, I felt the distance growing between us like a canyon slowly widening. I proposed a temporary separation from his family. Not forever, I emphasized. Just a few months to focus on us, to build our foundation without the constant interference, to remember why we decided to get married in the first place. He looked at me like I'd suggested something monstrous, something unforgivable. "You're asking me to choose," he said. "No," I said. "I'm asking you to prioritize, just for a little while, just until we're on solid ground." He couldn't do it, couldn't do. And in that moment, I saw our entire future laid out before me like a road I'd already traveled. Years of being second place. Years of biting my tongue at family gatherings while his mother made pointed comments about my inadequacies. Years of watching him apologize for me instead of to me. But I loved him. Despite everything, I loved the person he was when his parents weren't involved, when it was just the two of us and the easy connection that had drawn us together in the first place. So I stayed, hoping that time would prove me wrong, hoping that the wedding itself might mark a turning point. The wedding day arrived on a clear autumn morning that felt like a promise. I'd spent months planning it, trying to create something that reflected both of us despite his parents' constant interference. They'd wanted a church wedding with all the traditional trimmings. We compromised on an outdoor ceremony with a religious officiant. They'd wanted a guest list of 200 people, most of whom I'd never met. We'd negotiated down to 120. Every decision had been a battle, but I told myself that once we were married, things would be different. We'd be our own unit, our own family, with our own traditions and priorities. The venue was perfect, an old stone estate with gardens that overlooked a valley turning gold with autumn leaves. My dress fit like it was made for me, because I'd saved for months to have it custom designed. I walked down the aisle toward the man I loved, trying to ignore the disapproving expressions on his parents' faces in the front row, trying to focus on his smile instead of the tension in his shoulders. We were halfway through the vows when the commotion started. At first, I thought someone had fainted. There was shouting near the back of the seating area, the scrape of chairs being pushed aside, voices raised in confusion and alarm. I turned to look and my heart stopped in my chest. My ex was standing in the aisle, looking disheveled and wild-eyed and absolutely unhinged. He was shouting something about how I'd ruined his life, how I'd abandoned him without warning, how the guests deserved to know the truth about the woman standing at the altar. For a moment, nobody moved. The guests sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether this was some bizarre planned performance or an actual crisis. My groom's face had gone pale as marble. His parents were whispering urgently to each other, their expressions a mix of alarm and something else I couldn't quite read. I found my voice somewhere in the chaos. "You need to leave," I said, keeping my tone calm despite the panic flooding my system. "Whatever you think this is going to accomplish, you're wrong. This isn't your story to tell." He kept shouting. He called me names that made my grandmother gasp. He said I'd never loved him, that I'd used him and thrown him away like garbage, that everyone should know what kind of person they were watching get married. My friends and family were on their feet now, several of my male cousins moving toward him with clear intent in their posture. But before anyone could physically intervene, his tirade was interrupted. "She didn't abandon you," my best friend shouted from her seat in the front row. "You cheated on her for months. Everyone knows the truth. You don't get to rewrite history." More voices joined in. My aunt, who'd held me while I cried through those terrible weeks after the breakup. My college roommate, who'd helped me pack up his things and burn the letters he'd written me. Even one of his own former friends, someone who'd switched loyalties after the truth came out, stood up to contradict him. The real story spilled out in fragments, witness after witness dismantling his narrative. My ex faltered. The righteous anger drained from his face as he realized he'd badly miscalculated his audience, that the crowd wasn't going to side with him against me. Security finally arrived and physically escorted him out. But the damage was done. The perfect ceremony was shattered, replaced by something that felt like a crime scene. During the chaos, I noticed something that would haunt me for months afterward. His parents had pulled my groom aside, away from me, and were speaking to him with urgent intensity. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the noise of confused guests and security personnel, but I could see his face. He looked torn, conflicted, like he was genuinely considering whether the insane man who'd just crashed our wedding might have had a valid point. When he finally returned to my side, he didn't reach for my hand. He didn't pull me close or reassure me or ask if I was okay. He just stood there with his jaw tight and his eyes not quite meeting mine. The officiant, bless her professional composure, asked if we wanted to continue with the ceremony. I looked at my groom and waited. I waited for him to say yes without hesitation, to declare that nothing would stop us from getting married today, that some lunatic's tantrum didn't change anything between us. He hesitated. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, he hesitated. Finally, he said, "Let's finish this. Not I love you. Not we're going to be okay. Not I don't care what anyone says. You're the only one I want. Just let's finish this," in a tone that sounded more like resignation than commitment, more like stubbornness than love. We exchanged rings. We kissed, briefly and without passion. We were pronounced husband and wife, but as we walked back down the aisle together, my hand in his feeling like a stranger's grip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. He hadn't defended me. He hadn't chosen me. He'd just decided not to let his parents win. The honeymoon was beautiful on the surface. 2 weeks in a tropical paradise, far from family drama and wedding disasters, and the questions that had multiplied since that afternoon. We swam in crystal clear water that matched the postcards. We ate incredible food at restaurants overlooking the ocean. We slept late and made love and pretended that everything was fine, that the wedding had been a hiccup rather than a harbinger. But every time I caught him staring into the distance with that particular furrow in his brow, every time his phone buzzed with a message from his mother that made his face tighten, I felt the cracks widening in our foundation. He never wanted to talk about what had happened at the wedding. He dismissed my concerns about his parents' behavior during the chaos. When I asked directly what they'd been saying to him while my ex was being removed, he claimed he couldn't remember, that everything had been too overwhelming to process. We returned home to find that distance had only made his family fonder of interference. His mother had taken to stopping by unannounced, always when she knew he'd be home from work before me. She'd rearrange things in my kitchen, reorganizing cabinets I'd arranged specifically for my own convenience. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes about better ways to store spices, more efficient methods for organizing the pantry. She'd mention casually that she'd done his laundry since I clearly didn't have time to take care of my own husband, her tone making it abundantly clear that a real wife would have time. He stopped defending me. Not all at once, but gradually, like water wearing away stone. The comments that used to make him uncomfortable became things he barely seemed to notice. When I'd bring them up later, he'd sigh heavily and say I was making mountains out of molehills, that his mother meant well even if her delivery wasn't perfect, that I needed to learn to pick my battles. Then I discovered the financial betrayal. We'd agreed on a budget after the wedding. We'd agreed that the constant loans to his parents had to stop, that we needed to build our own savings and focus on our own future before we could keep bailing them out of every crisis. I thought we were finally on the same page. I found out we weren't when I was reconciling our accounts one evening and discovered 3 separate transfers to his parents' bank account over the past 2 months. Large transfers, the kind that required deliberate action and conscious decision-making, not just absent-minded generosity. When I confronted him, he got angry. Actually angry in a way I'd rarely seen directed at me before, a fury that felt like it had been building for months. "They're my parents," he snapped. "I'm not going to let them suffer just because you've got some personal grudge against them." "Some grudge?" I repeated, my own voice rising. "They've treated me like an intruder since the day they met me. They've questioned my character, my motives, my worth as a person, and as your wife. And you're sending them thousands of dollars behind my back while criticizing me for buying a new printer for my office." He didn't have a good answer. He just kept insisting that I didn't understand, that family was family, that blood was thicker than water, as if the woman he'd married wasn't supposed to be his family too, as if the vows we'd exchanged meant less than the expectations of people who'd never wanted our marriage to happen in the first place. Things deteriorated rapidly after that confrontation. He spent more time at his parents' house and less time at home. When he was home, he was distant and defensive, ready to interpret everything I said as an attack on the people who'd raised him. I suggested therapy again. He refused again, more firmly this time. I suggested a trial separation. He accused me of giving up on our marriage, of proving his parents right about me all along. The final breaking point came during a dinner with his parents that I'd agreed to as a peace offering. I'd decided to be the bigger person one more time, to try once more to build a bridge with these people who seemed determined to see me as the enemy. I wore a dress his mother had once complimented. I brought a bottle of wine from a vineyard she'd mentioned enjoying. I walked into that house prepared to be gracious and humble and everything they wanted me to be. His mother made a comment about the wedding about halfway through the meal. She said something about how it was a shame things had been so dramatic, how that unfortunate man had certainly caused quite a scene. Then she looked at me with an expression of false sympathy that made my skin crawl, and said, "Although I suppose he did have a point about some things, a woman who could leave one engagement for another so quickly, who could move on without any apparent grief." She let the implication hang in the air like poison. Something inside me snapped. All the months of biting my tongue, of swallowing my responses, of trying to be the bigger person while she made me smaller and smaller, it all came rushing out at once. I told her the truth. All of it. The cheating that had lasted almost our entire engagement. The gaslighting that had made me doubt my own sanity. The months of psychological manipulation I'd endured while everyone around me pretended not to notice. I told her that her son knew all of this, that he'd held me while I cried about it, that he'd promised he understood why I might need time to trust again. I told her that she and her husband had done nothing but undermine our relationship from the moment they found out about the prenup, that they'd taken our money while insulting my career, that they'd treated me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be welcomed. I told her that I was done pretending everything was fine. The silence that followed was deafening. My husband's face had gone through several colors during my speech, from pale to red to something approaching purple. When I finished, he didn't come to my side. He didn't acknowledge that anything I'd said was true. He looked at me like I was a stranger, someone he'd never seen before, and didn't particularly want to see again. And he said, "How could you disrespect my parents like this in their own home?" I realized then that I'd been fighting a losing battle all along. He wasn't torn between me and his parents. He'd made his choice a long time ago, probably before we ever walked down that aisle. I just hadn't wanted to see it, hadn't wanted to admit that I'd done it again, that I'd trusted someone who didn't deserve it. He declared that his family would always be his priority. He said it like it was a virtue, like his loyalty to the people who had been systematically cruel to me was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. I left that night. I packed a bag with shaking hands and went to my best friend's apartment and cried until there was nothing left inside me. Then I dried my tears, poured myself a drink, and called a divorce lawyer. The divorce was remarkably simple, an irony that wasn't lost on me. The prenuptial agreement that his parents had fought so hard against, that they'd called evidence of my mercenary nature, became my salvation. My business was protected. My assets were secure. 2 months after I walked out of that dining room, I was officially unmarried, free from a family that had never wanted me in the first place. I thought that was the end of the story. A painful chapter closed. Lessons learned the hard way. Time to move forward yet again. I'd done it before, and I could do it again. Then, 6 months later, I received an email that changed everything. It was from my ex. My first ex, the cheater, the gaslighter, the man who had crashed my wedding and called me names in front of everyone I loved. The subject line just said "I'm sorry," which almost made me delete it without reading. I'm glad I didn't. The email was a confession. He explained in detail that made my stomach turn that he'd been approached by my in-laws several months before the wedding. They'd found him through social media, tracked down mutual friends who might provide an introduction, researched enough of our history to know he might still harbor resentment about how things had ended. They'd paid him to create that scene at the wedding. I read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. They'd paid him. Actually handed over money, a significant sum according to his account, in exchange for him disrupting the most important day of my life. The email went on. He described the meetings they'd had in coffee shops and parking lots, the negotiations over how much it would cost to ensure he made a convincing scene. They'd known about our history, known that the breakup had been ugly, known that he might be willing to play the role of scorned ex-lover if the price was right. They'd coached him on what to say, how to frame his accusations, how to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone watching. He said he was telling me now because he'd done a lot of reflecting over the past months. Because he was in therapy finally dealing with his own issues, and his therapist had helped him understand the damage he'd caused to others. And, in a moment of brutal honesty that I had to grudgingly respect, because he'd seen on social media that I was single again and thought, maybe, just maybe, this confession might open a door to reconciliation. I laughed out loud at that last part. The sheer audacity was almost impressive in a horrifying kind of way. But the rest of the email, the information about my former in-laws and their scheme, that explained so much. The way they'd reacted during the chaos at the wedding, pulling their son aside for that urgent conversation while I stood alone at the altar. The hesitation in his voice when he'd said, "Let's finish this," as if he wasn't sure anymore whether he wanted to. The coldness that had crept into our marriage so quickly afterward. The doubt that seemed to have taken root overnight. They'd planned the whole thing, and when it hadn't worked to stop the wedding entirely, they'd used it as a tool to erode our marriage from within. Before I did anything else, I called my lawyer. I needed to understand my options, my rights, whether there was any legal action I could take against people who had deliberately sabotaged my life. She advised me to gather more evidence first, to document everything carefully, to be strategic rather than reactive. I reached out to my ex again through email. I asked if he'd be willing to repeat his confession to a third party to provide any proof of the payments he'd received. He agreed immediately. I think partly out of genuine guilt, and partly because he still harbored some delusional hope that cooperation might win him points with me. Then I made a decision that some people would probably call petty, and others would call justice. I decided to confront my former in-laws directly, face to face, and I decided to record the entire conversation. The meeting took place at their house on a Saturday afternoon. They seemed surprised to see me at their door, but not as hostile as I'd expected. I think they assumed I was there to grovel, to ask for reconciliation with their son, to admit that I'd overreacted and wanted another chance. I sat across from them in their living room, the same room where they'd interrogated me about my finances years earlier, and I told them what I knew. I showed them printouts of the emails. I watched their faces as they realized their scheme had unraveled, that their carefully constructed manipulation had been exposed. His mother tried to deny it at first, her face a mask of wounded innocence. She had no idea what I was talking about, she insisted. This was clearly some kind of misunderstanding, some lie that bitter man was telling to cause more trouble. When I made it clear I had evidence beyond just my ex's word, when I hinted that the paper trail was more extensive than she'd realized, she pivoted. The denial transformed into justification, with a smoothness that told me she'd been prepared for this moment. "We were protecting our son," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. "You weren't right for him. We could see it from the very beginning, from the moment he told us about your business, and your prenup, and your so-called independence. You were too headstrong, too focused on your own career, too unwilling to put family first the way a wife should. We did what any loving parents would do to save their child from a terrible mistake. So you paid someone to ruin my wedding," I said slowly. "You deliberately sabotaged your own son's happiness because I didn't fit your image of a good wife." She didn't even flinch at the accusation. "We saved him from making the biggest mistake of his life. He just doesn't understand that yet." My ex-husband arrived partway through this confrontation. His mother had called him, I assumed, and he'd rushed over to find out what was happening. I watched his face as he heard his parents admit to everything, as the scope of their manipulation became undeniable. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something like horror dawn in his eyes. He turned on them, really turned on them, raising his voice in a way I'd never heard before, demanding to know how they could do something like this, why they hadn't told him, how they expected him to ever trust them again after this. His mother's response was chilling in its calmness. "We did tell you," she said. "Not the specific details. Perhaps, but you knew we had concerns about the wedding. You knew we thought it shouldn't happen. You chose not to ask questions because you didn't want to know the answers. That's not our fault." The room went silent. I could see him processing her words, rewinding through memories, realizing how many signs he'd chosen to ignore, how many conversations had held double meanings he hadn't wanted to decode. He turned to me. His eyes were wet, his face crumpled with something that might have been shame or grief or both. He said he was sorry. He said he'd had no idea about the payment, about the explicit arrangement. He asked if we could try again, start over, build something new on the foundation of this painful truth. I looked at this man I had loved, this man I had married despite every warning sign, and I felt something unexpected wash over me. Not anger, not triumph, not even satisfaction at being vindicated, just a profound, exhausted sadness for both of us. I told him no. "You always had enough information to make different choices," I said, gently but firmly. "You didn't need this confession to see what was happening. You could have defended me at the wedding instead of hesitating. You could have believed me about your parents' behavior instead of dismissing my concerns. Every single time you had a choice between trusting me and trusting them, you chose them." He started to argue, to explain, to justify, and I held up my hand. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," I said. "I'm saying it because it's true. And because if you want to be different, if you want to break this pattern with whoever comes after me, you need to understand that the problem isn't just what your parents did, it's that you let them do it. You saw the signs and you looked away. That's on you." I left that house with my recordings and my evidence and something that felt almost like peace. Not happiness exactly, but the clean feeling that comes with finally knowing the whole truth, with having all the pieces of the puzzle arranged in their proper places. The aftermath was complicated. I consulted with my lawyer about my options and ultimately made a decision that I knew would be controversial. I made the recordings public. Not to the whole internet, not to strangers who had no stake in the situation, but to the people who mattered. Extended family on both sides, mutual friends who had heard only his parents' version of events, people who deserved to know what had really happened. There was significant pushback. Some people thought I should have kept everything private, that exposing them was vindictive, that I should have taken the high road and let karma sort things out eventually. Others thought they deserved far worse than mere exposure, that I should pursue legal action for intentional infliction of emotional distress. His parents threatened to sue me, but my lawyer assured me that since I was a participant in the conversation, recording it was perfectly legal in our state. For a few weeks, I was the subject of gossip and judgment from people I barely knew. Acquaintances had opinions about whether I'd handled things the right way. Strangers on social media weighed in with their verdicts. It was exhausting and often painful. But I'd made my decision knowing that would happen, and I stood by it. The truth was worth the temporary discomfort. I heard through mutual connections what happened in the months that followed. My ex-husband did confront his parents, did try to establish some distance from their influence. For a while, he made genuine efforts to build the independence he should have developed years earlier. He started therapy. He set boundaries. He tried to become the person he might have been if he'd had the courage to stand up for himself sooner. But patterns are hard to break, especially when you've never learned how. Especially when the people holding the strings have had decades of practice. About 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved back in with his parents. He'd had some kind of breakdown, quit his consulting job, and retreated to the only safety he knew, even though that safety was the same gilded cage that had destroyed his marriage. His parents welcomed him back with open arms, probably relieved to have their son under their complete control again. I feel sorry for him, genuinely. Not the complicated, frustrated pity I might have felt during the marriage, when it was mixed with hope that he might change. Just a clean, clear sorrow for a person who never learned to be free, who chose comfort over growth until it was too late to choose differently. As for me, I spent those 2 years focusing on rebuilding. I expanded my business into a second location in a neighboring town. I deepened friendships with people who had proven their loyalty during the hardest moments. I went back to therapy and worked through the residual trust issues, the tendency to second-guess my own instincts that 2 bad relationships had reinforced. When I started dating again, I did it differently. I took my time, refusing to be rushed by anyone's timeline but my own. I paid attention to details that mattered rather than getting swept up in chemistry and connection. When I met someone new, someone kind and emotionally intelligent and remarkably sane, I watched carefully how he interacted with his family. I watched for signs of enmeshment, for triangulation, for the kind of toxic dynamics I'd learned to recognize. His parents, it turned out, were wonderfully, boringly healthy. They respected boundaries without having to be told. They welcomed me warmly without interrogating me about my finances or my past relationships. They had their own full lives, their own interests and friendships, and didn't seem to need their son to complete them or validate their choices. We've been together almost 2 years now, and I still sometimes catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the hidden dysfunction to reveal itself. But the shoe never drops. He disagrees with me sometimes. He has his own opinions and his own preferences, and occasionally we argue about things that matter. But he never makes me feel like I'm competing with his family for his loyalty, never makes me doubt that I'm his priority. Last month, he asked if I'd ever consider getting married again. I told him honestly that I wasn't sure. The word marriage still carries weight for me, still triggers memories of ceremonies interrupted and promises broken, of walking down an aisle towards someone who wasn't sure he wanted to be there. He said he understood. He said there was no rush, no pressure, no deadline. He said he was happy to wait until I was ready, or to never formalize things at all if that's what I preferred. I think I might be ready someday. Not because I've forgotten what happened, not because time has erased the scars, but because I've finally learned the difference between caution and fear, between protecting yourself and closing yourself off entirely. Some people say that everything happens for a reason, that there's some grand design behind our suffering. I'm not sure I believe that, but I do believe that we can find meaning in what happens to us, even the painful parts. Especially the painful parts. My first engagement taught me that my instincts were worth trusting, that the quiet voice of doubt deserved to be heard. My first marriage taught me that love isn't enough if you're not both willing to fight for each other, that choosing a partner means choosing them over everyone else, again and again, and everything that came after taught me that I'm stronger than I ever knew, that I can survive things that feel unsurvivable and come out the other side. I still have a prenuptial agreement ready, updated now for my current business and expanded assets. My boyfriend knows about it. He's already said he'll sign whatever I need him to sign, whenever I'm ready. But the difference this time is that it doesn't feel like armor against expected attack. It just feels like common sense, like wearing a seatbelt even when you trust the driver. Looking back on everything, I don't regret the choices I made. Not the first engagement that taught me painful lessons. Not the marriage that showed me who I am when pushed to my limits. Not even making those recordings public, though I know it was controversial and some people still think it was wrong. Every step brought me here, to this apartment that's entirely mine, decorated exactly the way I want it, to this business I built from nothing but heartbreak and determination, to this relationship that feels like partnership instead of competition, to this life that's messy and complicated and absolutely, unequivocally mine. And honestly, after everything I've been through, after all the betrayal and manipulation and heartbreak, that feels like the greatest victory of all.